Dr. Carla Scott. I'm a professor of communication and the founder and principal of Dialogue, Diversity, and Dharma, LLC. I've had the pleasure of working with Hoyleton for almost 4 years now, implementing the initiative for diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the summer of 2022, we started offering sessions on why DEI, why now, for new employee orientation. This is an example of how Hoyleton is living the commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion by having that be one of the first pieces of information that new employees receive when they join the Hoyleton family. We want them to know that it's a part of everything that is done at this organization. And if you're an employee who started before July 2022 and you didn't get that in orientation, there are ways that you will be able to access this information. We're making modules that will be available online, and the Peers Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council will also be offering professional development sessions soon where you can attend and learn more about this initiative. The initiative is not just focused on creating a more inclusive culture at Hoyleton, it's also an opportunity for you to build your own capacity so that you can go out into your communities and share some of this knowledge. And that is the way we can help to transform society. Okay, what exactly do we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as it's commonly referred to, DE&I? Well, diversity refers to the representation of various identities and differences. Equity refers to fair and equitable treatment, access, and opportunity across those identities. And inclusion is the effort to create environments to respect and value all people. Oftentimes we've heard diversity referred to as being invited to the party to increase the various identities present, but that's not enough. Inclusion means you get asked to dance once you make it to the party. You may have seen depictions of the difference between equality and equity, because often we hear the question, well, what's the difference? Why isn't being equal enough? Why are we now talking about equity? Because equity, in the simplest terms, means fairness, which is not the same thing as equality. And as you can see in this image, equality means everyone gets the same box to stand on in order to watch the game going on the other side of the fence. Obviously, that doesn't work. The same box does not afford the opportunity and access for all three viewers. However, equity, again, it's not about everybody getting the same thing. It's about everybody getting what they need in order to improve the quality of their situation. So here we see the tallest member of this group needs no box at all, but the shortest member does have 2 boxes, which then gives them access. So that's an important part of equity to think about. What is needed to provide access and opportunity? And it's more than just the equality, meaning everyone gets the same thing. If we think about what equity really means with access, take a look at this image. It's obvious that someone who uses a wheelchair to move through life because of some mobility issues may not be able to use a box. We have to think about what access would mean for someone who moves through life with a wheelchair. They need a different kind of access. 2 boxes won't do it, but a ramp is exactly what is needed. This is a compelling image to help us better understand what access means, and the difference between equality and equity becomes very clear if you take a look at this image. Arthur Chan, who describes what we're talking about today very succinctly, I think. Diversity is a fact. If you think about the numbers when we are trying to perhaps share how many individuals of how many identities are in our organization or belong to our community or attend our school, we can actually open a document, and based on how those individuals have referred to themselves, we can say we have this many who identify in this way. Those are facts. How we will then respond to and interact with those identities in our organization is a choice. Do all of those identities have the same access for opportunity and success? This is where equity comes in, and again, it is a choice how we will respond to those diverse numbers that are indeed facts. Inclusion then is an action, what we will do to make sure the environment is equitable for all. And in that decision and those actions is where belonging becomes the outcome. So we want to think about this as the identities that are part of our organization, our community, our environment, and those other concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Identities, we need to think about the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to create belonging. But it's important here for me to point out that inclusion happens as a result of a process called human interaction, and that process is more specifically known as communication. I am a communication scholar. This is what I've studied for 35 years. And while most people would say communication is a very easy process, right? We talk, we listen. What's difficult about that? But as you will see in the next slide, there are elements of this process that complicate it. And if you look at the model, you can see what this process looks like. And on the side, you will see the elements of that model. Clearly, there are two communicators here. There are elements that represent what is happening. There's a sender and a receiver. Well, that's pretty obvious, right? But what we often forget is that while someone is sending, someone is receiving and also sending back. I'm obviously not able to see you, but if I'm in a group and I'm sharing information, I'm able to look at nonverbal behaviors. I am able to look at someone nodding their head, someone maybe scratching their head like they don't understand what was said. So think about that. When you are talking with someone, they are also sending messages back to you. This is a transactional process. It's back and forth and simultaneous. So we have the two communicators at this point sharing in this process of human interaction. There is a indication that we are encoding and decoding, two very important aspects of this process. Encoding means we choose words that we believe the other communicator will understand. Oftentimes we know people may use workplace jargon, and if you don't work in that workplace, you don't understand that language. One example could be slang. Young people come up with slang, and they use terms that folks, particularly their parents, don't understand because they aren't able to decode that. So encoding and decoding is a big part of this process because that is how the message, which is the element in the very middle, the message gets shared, and ideally, the goal would be for both communicators to have the same understanding of that message in the middle. But as you can see, there's an element in the middle called noise, and it looks like it's active. Noise interferes with that message getting transmitted from one communicator to another. Noise can be physical noise like a lawnmower outside. It can be traffic. It can be music that is too loud. It can also be psychological noise, such as stereotypes, prejudices, implicit bias, meaning one of the communicators in this model has some belief about the other communicator and they're not even aware of it because it's implicit. So noise can be a challenge in any kind of communication encounter, but particularly when we're talking about communication across different identities. And that's because when these two communicators come together, again, the goal is to have the message in the middle have shared meaning, but we can't always assume that that shared meaning of that message is going to be there. For example, what do you call a non-alcoholic carbonated flavored beverage? Can you answer that? Well, it depends on what area of the United States you live in. I'm not sure this is a global phenomenon, so let's just take the United States. Depending on where you live, if you're in the northern part of the United States, the preferred term is pop. Sort of in the middle, the more lime green, in the area of Illinois where Hoyleton is, we refer to it as soda. That's what I grew up referring to it as, soda. And then in the southern part of the United States, we have Coke. And we assume that's because Coca-Cola has a headquarters in Atlanta. And it is true, if you are in the turquoise area and you go into a McDonald's or a restaurant and you ask for Coke, they may often say, what flavor Coke? Because everything is a Coke. So this is a very easy example. It's oftentimes, I think, a humorous example to refer to. What if these two communicators weren't just from different geographical areas asking for a non-alcoholic carbonated flavored beverage? Suppose they were of different racial identities, or even different genders, or even a different age, different demographic, or social class. And suppose the term wasn't pop, Coke, or soda. Suppose we were trying to find a shared meaning of something like justice, or health, or even love. We often struggle to find the shared understanding of a term that is used so often, and we assume others have the same understanding of that term that we do, but that's not true. And one of the reasons it's complicated to create that shared meaning in the middle, because of these different identities coming together, is because of the cultural context. You will see at the top and at the bottom the gold lines around the side. Cultural context refers to the conditions and circumstances when a message is being communicated. For example, time of day. Do you think you're a morning person? Are you more of an evening person? Do you prefer not to talk to anyone until you've had your coffee? And you say that regularly. Do you know that the best time to engage in serious conversation is when someone has had maybe their time to come home from a long work day and sit in a chair, rest and relax? Or perhaps you know they need to engage in some form of meditation if you want to have a successful interaction. Yes, all of this is part of cultural context. It's who are the communicators, what is the place, the space, and even who are the others in the room when it happens. And yes, that's a deliberate nod to a very popular play, because we can even think of cultural context as specific periods in larger society and historical settings. So let's take one more look at the elements. Again, so you can see how complicated this process is. When individuals say, oh, we're just not communicating, maybe you can stop now and say, well, where is it falling apart? Is it in the message of the sender? Is it in the encoding? Did they not understand what you were saying? And one of my favorite examples of that is when a parent or caretaker maybe admonishes their teen to clean their room. And after a period of time, with the door closed and noise coming out of that said teen's room, the door is opened and the parent or adult caretaker goes in there and says, you think this is clean? Yes, shared meaning of clean is often a challenge at that time of adolescence. And maybe even earlier and after, but that's a good example of how different identities can create the challenges to having the shared meaning of a message. The channel, verbal, nonverbal, written, oral. We also know, as I pointed out earlier, you can speak verbally, use your that as the channel, but be aware of someone's nonverbal behavior when you are delivering your message. And again, the receiver, is that where it's falling apart with the decoding? And what about feedback? Someone's giving you feedback. They're offering responses, perhaps verbal or nonverbal, to your message. And then noise. So this is not an easy process. Again, the cultural context can create a lot of challenges, but cultural context is where I'd like to focus our work and attention with diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it is cultural context now that is providing opportunities for us to talk about the need for and a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. Cultural context is also where the concept of power can become obvious in a message and in the shared meaning making of that message, because that's where we can create connection in human interaction and where we can sustain that connection across identities. We need to talk about this very specifically so we can, again, emphasize the role of identity in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Identity is a critical component with communication because our identity influences how communication happens in an interaction. Again, you think of those two communicators in the model. They are both bringing who and how they are. And our interactions actually help shape the identities of the participants. I like to say it's how we walk through the world. We learn who and how we are. We learn that we are members of some groups and other groups we are not members of. We learn about our racial, ethnic, religious background and identities. And we become members of those groups. Identity is also prominent in expectations and behaviors when we communicate across and about identity differences and divisions. When we show up with our identity, communicators expect us to be one way or expect us to behave one way, and often that again is a manifestation or an example of their implicit bias. They may bring those prejudices and stereotypical notions when they expect us to behave in certain ways because we are a member of a certain social group living with a particular social identity. Social identity, I've used that term, but those are aspects of a person's self-image, and that's derived from group-based categories and refers to the ways in which individuals and collectivities are distinguished in their social relations with other individuals and collectivities. This is communication scholar Brenda J. Allen. I like to think of it as, once again, how we're bumping up against these experiences, opportunities, and others in our collective communities and groups. When we find ourselves in these groups, we learn in relating with the individuals in our families, our communities, our churches, our schools. Again, this is how we learn who and how we are. And those categories of social identities include race, gender, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, social class. Think about that. We all have ways of referring to ourselves as members of these social categories, group-based categories. We say, I am this, I am not that. When we are perhaps growing up, we have well-meaning family, friends, mentors, even in our schools, in our churches, where we are socialized or taught that we are members of certain categories. And we embrace them, or not. Not everyone embraces them. But in those everyday experiences growing up, that's where we learn this is who you are and this is who you are not. This is what we do and we don't do that. We worship this way. We go to this particular community in order to feel safe. This is what we believe. This is how we eat. This is what we don't eat. All of those are ways of learning who and how we are. That socialization process. Then we also are taught that this is who those people are, and they are not us. We don't eat that kind of food. We don't talk that way. We don't live that way. We often don't recall that we get these messages early in life and we internalize them. Again, that is what implicit bias is. And sadly, in this socialization process, we also learn that some identities are considered less than. They are deficient, and some are even dehumanized. And again, it could be implicit bias because we don't even know that we have embraced what we learned about group-based categories. This slide is a very clear, though not concise, it's ever-changing. This is not comprehensive, but it's a good example for you to look at how in those various social group categories of social identity one can identify. And you can see there are a variety of ways one can identify. Under race, for example, we have black, but often individuals choose African American, multicultural or bicultural, or biracial or multiracial are often terms that are used for individuals who find it difficult to say very easily, I am black, or I am white, or I am Native American. We are at a point, again, in this current cultural context where that is now acknowledged. Being biracial or multiracial was something that probably 100 years ago was certainly not as common as it is now. Maybe even 50 years ago. I know it's only recent in a census category. So there is a recognition now that this is not as simple as the binary of black and white. There's a lot to be said now about gender categories. We know that binary is being challenged as well. Looking at the other categories, you can see social class, how individuals might identify age, an ability, disability. As you can see, it is not just physical, but we're talking cognitive, physical, emotional. I've heard someone say we are all temporarily able-bodied because eventually we will all experience some degree of disability. Nation of origin or citizenship. And we've added body size and type and even caretaker, because all of these identities are what come with us when we show up in that process. Again, we come into a communicative context, we come into a process of interaction with another communicator. We identify, they assume aspects of our identity, and unfortunately, once again, they have expectations, some perhaps stereotypical, about those identities, particularly if they're very different from us. I'm looking at the example of religion and Christianity and Hinduism, Muslim, Jewish, individuals who come together and not understanding what it is to practice one's religion if they have not grown up in that environment and that community. So again, this is not comprehensive, but it is a good example of how various social identities can come and influence our interactions in that communication process. And before we leave this discussion of identities, we have to explore and consider the reality that within these groups, these social groups that we've just examined, some identities are what we consider agent groups. In other words, they are dominant social groups that have access to power, economic control. They provide the standards and norms. They are privileged by birth or acquisition. And often they knowingly or unknowingly exploit and benefit from unfair advantages over members of target groups. Now, it's often the case when someone who is living with an identity that is considered an agent group counters this definition. They say, well, I don't feel powerful, and I'm certainly not privileged. But again, that is something that is given by virtue of being a member of that identity. This is often the case with racial identities and gender. We know that race privilege and gender privilege both exist. We know that there's power associated with being perhaps a white male, perhaps wealthy, educated in the U.S. It's probably global, but again, our example will focus on the U.S. We know that there are privileges based on gender and race that have just been given as an advantage by birth. Nothing was done to earn them. It's just because you were born with this particular identity, you have privilege. Target groups, on the other hand, are disenfranchised, exploited, and victimized in a variety of ways, including being subject to containment, having restricted movement and choices, or being treated as expendable and replaceable and lacking individual identities apart from the group. So those who are in target groups are often lumped together. They're not seen as individuals, they're just part of, again, those people. But let's look at target groups once again, because in the definition of agent group and in the image you can see there, we have someone who is acting. They're pulling the bow and the arrow. In the target group, we have the target sitting there, and the arrow has landed. So you can think of agent groups do the acting. They have ability, they have power. Even think of the word agency. Hoyleton is an agency. They act in capacities to improve the lives of their clients. They have agency, they act. Target groups get acted on. They do not have the power. They are on the receiving end of what is often actions that do disenfranchise or exploit them or victimize them in a variety of ways. And this is why, again, cultural context is very important, because there was a time when those actions were inflicted on those group members and there was no way to resist, to fight back, or to organize so that they could be dismantled. We can see that in the women's movements. We can see that in the civil rights movement with people of African descent, black people in the U.S. We can even see it with the Americans with Disabilities Acts. All of those grew out of and continue to grow out of individuals who were once members of target groups and did not have the ability to act to change that disenfranchisement. They are now saying, no more. We don't want to live on the margins. And this is where power becomes obvious too. Because at one point, a limited number of people with a limited number of identities did all the acting. And who got acted on, particularly in ways that excluded, discriminated, or oppressed. That is changing in the 21st century in the current cultural context, because those identities that face those barriers to pursuing life, liberty, and success and well-being are now saying, no, we are pushing back. We are not going to live like this. We want our full humanity recognized. And this is not easy work, because for so long there was that power imbalance with agent groups telling the story, with agent groups deciding what would get done, with agent groups deciding which target group members could have access and equity in order to attain success, opportunity, and even well-being in life. So why DE&I now? And why is this something that Hoyleton has committed to? Well, because cultural context is everything. And in the cultural context of the third decade of the 21st century, this is where those who were once silenced, ignored, and dehumanized can now speak their truth and share their own lived experiences to build better understanding across identity differences. Think back to that model and that meaning of the message in the middle, where we're supposed to have a shared understanding of that message. To understand the lived experiences of someone who lives with an identity different from yours requires that we now hear their lived experience, that we ask them to share those lived experiences and engage in active listening so that we can better understand how their lives have been impacted in perhaps negative ways and work to change that so that they can be fully engaged in equitable situations. So the integration of DEI is to commit to communicating to better understand, create connection, and affirm the humanity of all identities. Not just some identities, but all identities. Because we're not accustomed to communicating across and about identity differences and divisions, we often avoid it. And that's the reality. Because we are not accustomed to communicating across and about identity differences and divisions, often we avoid it. Think about it. Oftentimes people will say, we don't talk about race. It's not polite to talk about race. But if we don't talk about race, we can't talk about racism. And how can we be in positions to dismantle systems, policies, and practices that support racism and all isms? These models on diversity, equity, and inclusion will introduce you to concepts and elements that Hoyleton has integrated so all staff can participate in an organizational culture that includes, supports, and affirms all all identities. This work can also support your personal growth as well, and your evolution in professional contexts. So while this is offered for employees and staff and members of the Hoyleton family, the goal is to have it become a part of our community interaction as well. We also recognize that this is not easy work, and so we offer these 4 C's, as I call them. I like to think that as we travel down this journey and proceed to learn more so you can do different, bring with you curiosity, courage, commitment, and compassion. And at Hoyleton there is also a 5th C to help you, and that is community.